So this is going to be a real-time look at how I do some of my drawings. If you've watched one of my one other previous video up to this point around this ledger, I've done a flip through and talked about the process a little bit. But so this is me just starting on a fresh page and getting ready. I don't really make too many decisions ahead of time. I tend to just sort of approach each of these. I don't know. It's a blank page, and you'll see in a moment here. I'm being a little fiddly about it. I had just actually cleaned my desk at this point, so normally I have stuff scattered all over the desk, kind of ready to go. But you'll see anyway. I might as well talk about it. I'm bringing out a few of the really simple tools that I use pretty much every time. You see there's a few just basic pencils in there. I've got a couple of these Stipulo All Right, the black and the white one that I use very frequently. And I do use a bunch of other pencils and tools, but I go back to some really standard ones. And I keep over here on this side that I'm pulling out. It's just a box of really kind of some self-made and some just collected bits and pieces of scrap paper. Some of it's printed, some of it's just plain, some of it's from old kids' kind of elementary school workbooks. It's a strange collection that both Gail and I have. We've got a bunch of these old, especially from the 30s and 40s. We sort of happened upon kids' workbooks. So it's their spelling homework, their geography homework, whatever it might be. And then here I've got this drawer over that you can't see just behind me, and I'm picking just a few colors to start off with. I don't always lay down paint to begin with, but I do find it's a nice starting place. You'll see kind of in a moment here that I'm making choices, but it is kind of haphazard isn't the right word, but it's, you can tell there I'm not being overly specific about the placement of that paint. And then here we go. So it's kind of like like a few other things I do. I'm trying to get down some, both obviously color as a starting point, but also just some sort of forms and mostly motion, like trying to get at kind of a shape that has a certain kind of motion to it. And for whatever reason, I always gravitate to using that really big, it's obviously not really meant for paint. It's kind of like a spackling blade or whatever, for smoothing out. If you put some polyfill in a wall, you might grab one of those to smooth it. But I use it fairly frequently in painting. We're seeing here the color combination that I go back to similar colors at the very least. I often have this yellow is a bit different. It's like a fairly rich yellow ochre. I don't go for that too often, but yellows in general, pinks and oranges are some favored kind of tones. And I think what I've picked here, so I've got that yellow ochre, I've got a pink, which I forget what that one's called, but you can see it's this sort of like warm, it's not peachy, but it's got a kind of a warmth to it. I favor warm colors, I think, in general. Obviously, I do use blues and that sort of thing, but even those, yeah, I guess what I'm getting is I don't go for cool colors as often. I think I gravitate towards, so even in a pink, for instance, I don't as often use like a cool pink, which so that would rule out something that veers closer to purple or even like a light magenta kind of thing. I don't go for that too often. But then, so here's another, like just adding a little bit. This is like I should have taken note of exactly which paints these are, but it's some sort of like ultramarine blue or something like that. Here's just talking tools. I quite like this little silicone scraper. It's got a few different sides, so you can do different kind of detail levels. I usually just use that widest side, but you can see it's got that little kind of two different wedges on the sides. It's kind of quite a handy tool because it's soft. You can put as much or as little pressure on it as you want to kind of get different effects. Anyway, so interesting there. So I guess in terms of what I'm actually doing here, you can see that I tend to do this with, this one's maybe a little bit more blocky than I would normally. Obviously, in this case, I'm trying to go for these kind of rectangular forms. Sometimes I just go very kind of more diagonal swooping kind of shapes, but in this case I decided I wanted, and by decided it just would have happened. I'm not planning anything here. Just as I was making these marks, these shapes with paint, just sort of starting with something that's a little bit more linear. One of the things I was doing there that is a good reason to use these kind of silicone applicators is that you can see I make kind of incise marks into the wet paint with the soft side, but it doesn't, unlike using a palette knife, there's no threat of cutting through the paper or anything like that. So you can make fairly sharp lines, but they're sort of safe. Another little process note for anyone who cares about this sort of thing is that you can tell I don't keep very clean tools, but I do sort of wipe them down, and that wipe is, you can buy these just like really cheap things of baby wipes at the grocery store. So that's all that is. It's like, so it's slightly kind of lubricated. Oh, there I am doing a little head cameo. Okay, now, so here I am just sort of going in, like once, you can tell obviously there's no pause there. This is all, I'm not pausing at any point during this. Any gaps you'll see are just live. So I don't, it's not entirely that I'm impatient, but it is somewhat that I'm impatient. I don't really wait for paint to dry in between things. Sometimes it'll happen just because I'll be prepping things, but you can see I've kind of immediately gone into like using, this is one of these, it's not it's a Stabilo, but it's not an Allwright. It's actually like a watercolor pencil crayon, or like a watercolor graphite, I should say. Like, what's the word I'm looking for? Water soluble graphite. And so, but it's also a darker one. So it's nice for kind of doing pencil-like lines. You can see sometimes I do this sort of like try things correct, whether the correct is the right word, but it's just sort of like seeing what works. And then it's one of the benefits I think here of like talking about working on top of wet paint is like there's still kind of action going on with the paint. There's still you can still move things around. You can still make decisions. So as much as it sometimes causes me problems, occasionally I'll kind of make some weird boo-boos because I haven't really accounted for paint being too wet in certain situations. But anyway, like you can see, it lets you do kind of stuff like this where you can add in even a little bit more motion, a little bit more kind of depth by kind of cutting back through. Even though this is really, if you haven't watched the kind of Ledger introductory video, it's a 90-year-old or so Ledger book, and the paper is actually one of the most terrible surfaces to be using to do any sort of especially wet media kind of work, but I still am choosing to use it in that way. And so sometimes when I'm making these, even with a pencil line, that if the paper's wet enough, I'll just scrape right through the page. So even if you have if you have or you're going to watch the Ledger sort of walkthrough intro video, you'll often see tape on the opposite side, the opposite page. That's usually where I've scraped right through a page, either by cutting with a pencil or by going through with a palette knife or something, because the paper was just too wet. So it's not like I'm that aggressive, but it's just crappy paper. Anyway, so now I'm just doing, now that's just a regular pencil. I really like, for some reason, in the middle of the road, it's an F pencil. So if you follow the HB versus H versus B kind of pencil dynamics, like that's kind of hard versus soft essentially. I like F. It's actually right in the middle. I think the F stands for fine. I could be totally wrong about that, but I do like it as it's a dark enough but not too soft, and then not, sometimes the really high H pencils are just so hard that they barely make a mark. They're just gray. So I like, if I'm going to use a pencil, I like it to have a bit of darkness to it. Okay, so anyway, you can see at this point that I'm keeping everything at a distance. You're not really seeing every single one of these marks, but the intention isn't really that any one mark is all that critical. But I do a lot of mark making. Sometimes I would I would say too much sometimes. I think there's a certain level of kind of graphomania that can happen when it's like, if something doesn't feel finished, or it's just that I'm feeling that I want to make lots and lots of marks. I just get a little carried away with that. But okay, so you just saw there I have a few marks that are recurring. And that kind of that's not a cross, but kind of, I think of them kind of as like registration points in a sense. There's a few things in my drawings that are like kind of grounding elements or framing elements, and so that little plus, and I'll sometimes do multiples of those that kind of form. It's almost like if you think of map making or surveying, that sort of thing, or certainly printmaking, it's like it would form the frame of reference for the kind of rectangle that's forming this page. The page already does that, obviously, so there's no need for it. But for whatever reason, it's become really like a favored mark that I return to, those little kind of pluses. Here I am. I'm sort of testing there to see, like, okay, how wet is this thing? Because I'm maybe wanting to go a little further, but I know that it's too wet to really do anything more. So let's start looking at papers here. So, okay, so the first thing I've pulled out there, I may or may not end up using everything I pull out, which is the purpose of pulling out a bunch of things. So I'm just sort of reacting this bin of scraps that I have here. So the first thing there was that it's a bit of player piano roll that I've spray painted on top of, and then a nice like super neon pink paper. It's just from a bunch of paper from the dollar store. I'm sort of like, it's a funny thing, like looking through scraps. It's sort of like, well, what are you looking for when you're looking through what essentially just looks like someone else's garbage bin, right? It's like, I guess the answer is I don't know. It's just sort of going through, looking at those scraps and thinking like, okay, is this the right thing? Is this the right thing? And like, what might work with what's already started here. I don't know where they're going to go or anything, or whether they're going to use the whole scraps or whether I'm going to use them at all. But it's just sort of like all of these drawings. It's just going by feel and just thinking like, oh, okay, what feels right now. So obviously I've got like a few different. Okay, I've decided on. So the other thing with the dots, there was also from a player piano roll, and I sort of decided on one or the other. The player piano rolls, I've said in a previous video, they're just really interesting things to work with as a collage element. They've got all the perforations, which are the things that actually control which keys are being played and in what rhythm kind of thing. And so the look of those already has just like this really interesting graphic look. They of course remind me of computer punch cards, which serve a very similar purpose. It's essentially player piano rolls it's like a data. That is the data of a song in a paper roll, and the machine reads that data by like going into those holes, and so where there's a perforation, there's a note. But graphically, they're just very interesting to work with. Okay, so now we're here. The sheet I brought out there is, again, some circles that I've sprayed onto some paper with some very bright orange. And I'm just going to cut out some smaller circles from those circles. So the nice thing about making your own kind of collage materials is that you get these sort of things where you've made a decision initially to color decision, a shape decision. I work with circles quite a bit, but then instead of just using these outright, I can actually so I've drawn 3 smaller circles on top of this big circle with the point of cutting out those 3 circles. And then I'm just going to cut them out with a pair of actually fairly crappy scissors. I should keep a better pair of scissors by my desk, but these do the job anyway. And then, okay, so instead of cutting those out, I'm going to start sort of seeing where I might be putting things. Just sort of seeing if, these forms work with the kind of rectangle shapes I already have. Okay, here I go. So the point I was going to make about cutting these circles is that I do have actual circle cutters here and there. There's actually in this frame up at the top there, that yellow thing, and then there's a little blue thing just to the left of it. Those are actually circle cutters for just like very cleanly slicing circles out of paper or card. But sometimes, and I do use those, but sometimes I choose to do this, which is just like by hand cutting the circle out. There's something about having an imperfect circle that works better sometimes for me. And by works and better, that's all kind of relative, of course. These would be terrible for someone else, but I like a level of rawness of kind of rough around the edges kind of feeling to things. All right, so looks like I'm going to do another circle of the same size. So this, you can tell by how painted and that sort of thing, that circle template, I've used that now for the last, 5 or 6 years or so. I've been using that circle template, maybe a bit more than that. And so it's, I got it at a point where I realized that I was already kind of using circles as a motif, and I wanted to have some level of repeatability to that, because sometimes it's what I want, like I say, roughness, but then I also want a sort of balance, and that balance sometimes comes from not true symmetry, but sort of the appearance of symmetry or repetition, if that makes any sense. So it's like sometimes having the ability to to at least start with a circle or another kind of template, but circles is the most common, that is already true, that is already a specific size, can be helpful. So yeah, just making choices here of like what shapes. I don't always collage in here, but over the last couple of years, really, I have been doing quite a bit of mixed, like painting, drawing, collage altogether. I call these drawings. It all feels like drawing to me. So there, I suppose someone else would call them like a mixed media artwork or something like that. But that, I think here that one piece of paper is already partially stuck down to the wet paint, but I'll have to pull it up. Mixed media has become such a strange loaded term because it can mean there was an older meaning to it, which I still kind of ascribe to, which is essentially like art that doesn't have to fall within a particular media, because when you do that, oftentimes you have to play by that media's rules to a certain extent. But mixed media has also become a strange, like, not to denigrate anything else, but I think in connection with things like kind of art journaling or scrapbooking, or there's whole lines of commercial products that are for quote unquote kind of mixed media art making. And some of them are actually fun products to use. So it's like, and there's nothing, definitely nothing wrong with the creation of things using whatever it is you want to create with. I guess I mean, when I think of mixed media art, is that I have always wanted to be able to do whatever form of art making or whatever combination of things. So it's like the idea of doing one day making music, the next day making collage, the next day making a 3D assemblage, the next day drawing something, like drawing an actual person or a figurative drawing or something like that with pencil, and just sort of being able to jump around between not just media but styles. I've always kind of preferred that. I've never really wanted to do just one thing or to repeat one thing. That said, I have these like modes and repetitive kind of marks and repetitive kind of ways of doing things that, like I say, even going back to that kind of registration point plus in the corner there, it's like I have things that have become common for me and that I do repeat purposefully, but I don't. They also come and go. Like sometimes I'll have a motif that is in every drawing for weeks, and then all of a sudden it just goes away. So anyway, the point of all that being that what was my original point? Oh, is it because talking about these as drawings? For some reason, I've just always thought of most things I do in the visual sphere as being drawings. And some of it is because I use quote unquote kind of drawing tools. Like I favor things like pencils over brushes, for instance. But of course, you could draw with a brush, so it doesn't really make any sense. I'm probably just like making another set of rules for myself. But anyway, you can see here. Talk a little bit about what's happening. So I had cut out those 3 orange circles and the 1 pink circle and 2 pieces of player piano, and I'm sticking them down. This is one of the ways. Sometimes I'll use a glue stick. Sometimes what I'm using right now is just an acrylic gel medium, just like a matte medium. It has the effect of because it's wet itself, it will kind of activate everything around it. So it may end up grabbing paint from the nearby areas and moving it over top of the things I've just put down. To someone else, that would be terrible because they're putting something on top. But I'm actually I actually like that to a certain degree. I will occasionally. I just got a new baby wipe there, so what I will occasionally do is wipe down some of those areas. First, I'm just so this is just to kind of flatten out that medium, so it's not there's not too much of it gooped up on top. But then I will sometimes wipe off the excess. Yeah, so I'm doing it right there, just to pull out some of the details that I want to make sure are in the original paper medium. So the other thing, I'll often just use a glue stick for this, but that's often when I have a dry surface already and I'm placing things on dry. So when I'm working kind of wet on wet like this, the gel medium works well. You can see in this case that I've got this I started with those painted kind of rectangular shapes, almost like this boxed in kind of double L thing happening. And I'm following along with that to a certain extent where I'm using each of those kind of box areas as its own area. So like the dots kind of stay within those boxes and they use the same kind of, there's kind of a vertical up and down thing going on here where let's say the top yellow paint rectangle is kind of balanced by that little player piano piece of paper that I put on there, and then bounces down to the orange and then back to the blue in the corner. So I don't work a lot with real symmetry. Okay, so you can see now I've added one of those little plus registration points in the top right corner. So I've got them top and bottom, and to me that it, like I said, it sort of forms this frame within the frame. Pausing here because I think it's wet because if there's all of the matte medium on there, and two, just to get a sense of like, well, where do I go from here? Okay, yeah, I've pulled out this little book, this little I think it's a Scouts first aid manual, basically. I'm doing that I have a few of the books around me near this art table, and what I tend to go for is not anything visual, but actually just words. Sometimes words will just come to me, but I like incorporating text and language into my drawings in a fairly literal way. I think there's a bit of a stigma around actually using words in this kind of art because maybe it's seen as too easy or something. I don't really care. But it's, to me, it's just another form of mark making, and it's another way of associating both shapes and meaning. Because I think everything is going to come with some level of meaning, whether it's color choice or shape choice or that sort of thing. So in this case, I've looked at that little book, and there are some words or phrases that kind of stood out to me that I'm adding another registration point there. And so yeah, I've chosen some words, and I'm trying to think, because I have a fairly specific structure here, I'm trying to see where I might want to have words, because they don't, in this case, they don't have a lot of space where they could go, because I'm doing because the kind of positioning, the framing of this one is fairly boxy. I mean, that said, I guess like I don't when I'm even when I'm writing words like this. I think I actually decided against this. I was working already on sort of wet, and the interesting thing there with so that's baby wipe. You can actually just take the pencil right back off. So one benefit of working wet on wet to a degree. I think I just didn't. In that case, that word I put in there was I wasn't planning, and so it was too jammed in this space that I started it. Anyway, the thing about words to me is that there's whatever they are, sometimes just combinations of words have a kind of a feeling to them that creates that just sort of extends the overall, like it takes you into a different kind of sense of the artwork. Whereas if you're looking at purely visual forms, color, dots, squares, lines, there can be an emotional response and some sort of intellectual, but I think the words bring in a bit of an intellectual response, which is maybe why some people don't like to have words in artwork like this, because it takes them out of that. I like the movement back and forth between intellectual and emotional, and so so the words I've written here are compression phase. So it doesn't the words. That's just whatever struck me when I was looking through the little book. I can't even tell you right now like what the connection was, but it's a first aid book, so something about probably compression on a wound or something like that. It doesn't really matter in this case. I'm not trying to reference first aid. I'm not trying to reference anything specific. There was just something about that kind of phrase, those two words together. And then, dislocation is also clearly connected with the first aid, but all these words can also have whatever kind of meaning people might want to ascribe them. So compression, dislocation can certainly be emotional states. And, a lot of the drawings I do are also kind of like, they're certainly about emotions. They're also about sort of points in time or movement through time. So like, I probably, I'm now sort of analyzing my choice here, whereas in the moment, there wasn't that level of analysis present. Like I wasn't making a conscious choice of like, oh, compression means this and dislocation means this. I say that in a funny voice as if that would be bad, but that's just not how this works for me. It's just like the words sometimes come and or sometimes pop out of some other text, and they're just a means for furthering this sort of drawing, just getting a different sort of sense of interaction between the visual forms and and that sort of text, and maybe almost implying that there's another level of meaning. And it's not to say that there can't be, but in a case like this, there isn't explicitly a meaning that I'm trying to get, and there isn't a point. These drawings for me are about the making of them. They are about the process of drawing and deciding and choosing and combining, and making marks in the various forms. You can see here over this last little while with a couple of different pencils, I'm kind of going over the whole surface and making marks, going oftentimes if I've collaged things, if the collage pieces themselves are, in this case they're not clean because they've already got spray paint on them, but I often like to have multiple layers of small marks, scribbles, if that makes sense, just to I think, like I said, they give a bit of motion, and they also make it feel like there's a layering that's going on that's beyond the layers of like paint, then paper, then pencil. That there's more activity happening. So here's an example here of kind of simple, imprecise precision, I'll call it. So I've got this handy dandy, really old. This ruler is, I think, from the 40s or 50s. I've got a strange collection of random rulers. Oftentimes these rulers they're the type of rulers businesses used to give away as a it's a hardware store or something, or even maybe something unrelated to, like it could even be an insurance company or something would give you a ruler. Anyway, the point being here, I'm not, like I was just putting down some dashed lines there because that's another common motif for me, but I'm not really being specific. I'm making those sort of ticks, and I want to draw them in a somewhat straight line, but I don't care actually about their placement. So here too, I'm drawing a bit of a grid formation using the ruler, but I'm not measuring. Like I'm kind of eyeballing the size of these things. And partially in this case, it's this is somewhat of that, like I don't know if it's not quite the graphomania, but wherever I see a kind of flat form, I will occasionally react by filling it with marks. So in this case, I saw on that side that area that was just sort of like that open area of pink, and I thought, well, let's get some more drawing in there. But this is also recently, I've been doing a bit more of this kind of hand-drawn grids. So it's like I say, it's inaccurate accuracy. It's it's unspecific specificity, whatever silly phrase I want to make up. It's a way of like implying or applying a specific kind of measured outcome, but then there's an intention in it not being that precise. So here I'm putting this is another new kind of common thing I'm putting within that grid, these kind of semicircles, and I'm using the circle form to make the shape, but I'm not really exactly measuring where they go. I'm just sort of eyeballing that. Yeah, there's this is a recent sort of semicircles inside of a grid in formation is a recent thing. I'm not sure where it's come from. There was in a previous video I did mention it in connection with the drawing of kind of scale or armor kind of shapes, where you have those series of semicircles that kind of form like a, it's not chainmail, but the kind of link mail kind of armor. it came somewhat out of that, but it's also sort of just like an extension of the circle forms that are fairly common. And so there's a point that comes sometimes where it's just like, oh, I'm done, and I don't really know that I'm leading there, but then it's sort of like I've made a last mark, and I'm like, yep, okay, that's it. And it's often at that point where I will just assign a title, right, thinking about that. So here's a bit of a closer look. You can now get some of those lines and see a little bit better some of the and